Charlotte crossed the glass lobby of Sterling Tower and laughed in front of the board when she saw the single father near the elevator in his faded uniform. She called Mason a man who only opened doors, with no place near real power, but when her bodyguard, Hunter, stepped forward to pull him away, his face turned pale. Hunter recognized the stance, the eyes, and the thin scar on Mason's wrist. 3 years earlier, this quiet man had taken down an entire protection team during a mission so secret that almost nobody who lived through it ever spoke of it. If you want to know why the bodyguard trembled, follow this story all the way to its final, breathless word. The morning had started cold in Chicago, the kind of cold that pressed against the glass walls of Sterling Tower and turned every reflection silver. Inside, the building was already moving at the pace of a company bracing for judgment. The board was arriving, along with outside investors and an internal audit team that had been circling the company for weeks. Assistants moved through the lobby, with tablets pressed to their chests, security badges blinking red and green at the turnstiles, and somewhere above on the top floor, Charlotte Sterling was preparing to defend her seat at the head of the company her father had built. Mason was still there when the first wave of executives walked in, finishing the tail end of his night shift, his uniform a little worn but clean, his posture straight in a way that nobody in that lobby ever noticed. To most of the people who worked above the 10th floor, he was simply the man who checked badges and opened doors, a fixture as forgettable as the potted plants near the elevators. He spoke little, asked for nothing, and carried himself with a stillness that some mistook for emptiness. Nobody in that glass lobby knew that the calm in his eyes had been earned in places far colder than a Chicago winter. Charlotte entered with Hunter at her side and a small cluster of assistants trailing behind her, her shoulders tight with the particular tension of someone who had not slept enough and could not afford to show it. A senior director from operations intercepted her before she had even crossed the threshold, complaining that the night guard had blocked a visiting executive at the private elevator over what he called a badge irregularity. He used the word irregularity the way men like him used most words, as a shield for the real complaint underneath it, which was that someone beneath him had dared to question someone above him. Charlotte, already strained and already late, did not ask for details. She simply turned toward Mason and let her frustration find its target. She told him, in front of the gathering crowd, that he had embarrassed the company and embarrassed her personally, and that a man in his position had no right to question anyone who walked through that lobby with the right name attached to them. Mason tried to explain, calmly and without raising his voice, that the badge in question had triggered 3 separate verification failures and that the visitor's access history did not match anything on file. Charlotte cut him off before he finished the sentence, telling him that a single father working the night shift was in no position to decide who belonged near the people who ran this company. The words landed hard, and they landed in front of dozens of witnesses, some of whom had already lifted their phones, not to record anything dramatic, just out of the instinct people have when they sense a moment about to become a story. Mason did not argue further. He simply looked past her shoulder toward the private elevator, where the man he had stopped earlier had already slipped away through a side corridor while everyone's attention was fixed on the spectacle in the lobby. Charlotte kept speaking, her voice climbing in volume and certainty, telling him that people like him needed to remember exactly where they stood in a building like this one. The crowd grew quieter, not because they agreed with her, but because public humiliation has a way of silencing a room even when nobody in it feels good about what they are watching. It was Hunter who moved first, stepping forward at an unspoken cue from Charlotte to physically remove Mason from the area near the executive elevator. He had done this kind of thing 100 times before without a second thought, the practiced motion of a professional clearing an obstacle. But as he closed the distance and his hand rose toward Mason's shoulder, something in his own training caught his attention before his mind did. A flicker of recognition in the angle of Mason's stance, the way his weight had shifted almost imperceptibly onto the balls of his feet. Hunter's eyes dropped without his permission to the thin pale scar crossing the inside of Mason's wrist, and the color drained slowly from his face. He stopped less than a foot away, his hand frozen in midair, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Hunter felt something close to fear standing in front of a man half the room had just finished mocking. Charlotte noticed the hesitation immediately, because Hunter never hesitated, not in 3 years of standing beside her through board fights and security threats and late-night transfers of sensitive material. She did not yet understand what had changed in the space of 2 seconds, only that the ground beneath her certainty had shifted slightly, and that the silence spreading through the lobby was no longer about the man she had just humiliated. It was about the man who had suddenly become too afraid to touch him. A few hours earlier, before the lobby and the laughter and the slow draining of color from Hunter's face, Mason had been in his small apartment across town, moving through the quiet, practiced routine of a man getting ready for a night shift. The apartment was modest and tidy, the kind of place that held no extra furniture and no wasted space, every object in it serving some purpose. A short phone call interrupted him as he tied his boots, his voice softening the moment he heard the small voice on the other end, and a folded medical bill sat on the counter beside his keys. A quiet reminder of why he needed this job to stay exactly as boring and stable as it was. He answered the call with patience he rarely showed anyone else, promised he would be home before morning ended, and set the phone down with the careful gentleness of a man who had decided, long ago, that nothing in his life mattered more than being someone his daughter could count on. He had taken the security job at Sterling Tower because it asked nothing of him beyond steadiness, a fixed schedule, and the kind of invisibility that let him keep his evenings free and his mornings predictable. More than one supervisor over the years had quietly remarked that Mason seemed overqualified for a guard's post, noting the way he read a room before he ever read a badge, but he always deflected those remarks with a short answer and a change of subject. Nobody pressed him about his past, partly because he gave them nothing to press against, and partly because there was something in his stillness that discouraged casual curiosity. At Sterling Tower, he had become known less for who he was than for what he noticed, memorizing every camera angle, every blind corner, and every fire exit until the building's layout lived in his head the way other men remembered their childhood streets. The people at the bottom of the company's hierarchy liked him for reasons that never reached the executive floors. He fixed a jammed door for the cleaning staff without being asked, walked late shift workers to their cars when the garage felt unsafe, and once spent an unpaid hour helping a junior accountant whose access card had failed at 2 a.m. The people at the top barely registered his existence at all, treating him the way they treated the elevators or the air conditioning, present, useful, and beneath consideration. Connor, the company's operations director, had crossed paths with Mason more than once, and had always found his rigid adherence to security procedure faintly irritating, the kind of irritation that powerful men feel toward anyone who slows down their plans with rules. In the weeks before that cold morning, Connor had been quietly escorting a rotating group of unfamiliar visitors into the building under the label of outside auditors, a label that raised no questions from anyone who did not look too closely. Mason looked closely. He noticed that the photographs on several of the visitor badges did not quite match the faces wearing them, that authentication codes appeared to have been duplicated rather than freshly issued, and that the timestamps on certain access logs had been altered in small, careful increments that only someone trained to look for tampering would ever catch. He filed a report through the internal security system, flagging the irregularities in plain, specific language, and waited for a response that never came because Connor had quietly intercepted and buried it before it reached anyone with the authority to act. Mason understood, almost immediately, that this was not an accident of bureaucracy. Something deliberate was moving through the building, and whoever was steering it had enough reach to silence an internal warning without leaving fingerprints. When one of the unfamiliar visitors approached the private elevator that morning with a badge Mason had already flagged in his own private notes, he made the only decision available to a man with no authority left to escalate through. He stopped the man himself, in full view of the lobby, and accepted the cost of that decision without protest. That cost arrived within minutes in the form of Charlotte's voice rising over the lobby, and Mason absorbed it the way he absorbed most things, without flinching and without explaining more than once. From a window on the second floor, Connor watched the entire scene unfold with quiet satisfaction, certain that the noise of public humiliation would bury the real story underneath it. He had not expected the guard to notice anything in the first place, and watching Mason now, calm even while being dismantled in front of dozens of witnesses, Connor felt a small, cold flicker of unease creep into his certainty. Whatever this man was, Connor realized, he was not the kind of obstacle that simply disappeared once you embarrassed him. Charlotte had inherited Sterling Group 2 years earlier after her father stepped down from the company he had spent 3 decades building, his health finally forcing him out of a chair he had never planned to leave so soon. She was sharp, decisive, and fluent in the language of finance and strategy, the kind of leader who could walk into a room of skeptical investors and leave them nodding within 20 minutes. What she had never been forced to learn, not really, was how to recognize danger that did not arrive wearing a balance sheet. The board had grown restless in recent months, rattled by a string of failed contracts, a falling stock price, and a data breach nobody had yet managed to trace back to its source, and Charlotte felt every one of those failures pressing against the back of her neck whenever she walked into a meeting. Connor had positioned himself as her most loyal advisor through all of it, always close, always reassuring, always whispering that she needed to project more strength and stop letting lower-level employees chip away at her authority in front of people who mattered. Hunter had come into her life through a respected security firm with an impeccable file, all sharp skills and clean references, and he said almost nothing about where those skills had been built. Charlotte trusted him completely, treating him as the final wall between herself and anything the world might throw at her, never once questioning what kind of world had shaped a man capable of building that wall in the first place. In the meeting that morning, she needed, more than anything, to look like a woman fully in command of her own company, especially with the board watching her every move for signs of weakness. When the complaint about the night guard reached her, framed by Connor's allies as a small embarrassment that needed correcting immediately, she saw an opportunity to demonstrate exactly the kind of authority everyone seemed to be questioning. Rather than asking a single question about why the badge had failed verification 3 times, she chose instead to make Mason an example, a visible lesson in who held power inside Sterling Tower and who did not. She had no idea, in that moment, that the man she was making an example of had just stopped someone directly connected to the breach the board had been demanding answers about for weeks. The more she humiliated him, the more relief Connor allowed himself to feel, certain that whatever Mason had noticed would now be buried beneath gossip and embarrassment, rather than investigated by anyone with real authority. Hunter, who had walked into that lobby viewing Mason as nothing more than another uniform among dozens, found his understanding of the man shifting the instant he stood close enough to really look at him. That shift in Hunter created the first crack in Charlotte's certainty that morning, a small fracture she did not yet have the language to explain. She watched Hunter, a man who had never once flinched in 3 years of standing beside her through threats both real and imagined, suddenly avoid looking directly at a person he had been ordered to physically move. Charlotte turned her eyes toward Hunter, silently demanding an explanation he did not offer, his jaw tight and his hand still frozen in the air between himself and Mason. The silence stretched longer than it should have, long enough that even the assistants near the elevator banks stopped pretending to check their phones. Somewhere underneath her irritation, a quieter and more uncomfortable question began to form, one she would not be able to answer for several more hours. Why would a bodyguard trained to fear nothing suddenly look afraid of a man who only opened doors? Hunter's mind had pulled him backward, without his permission, to a private security operation 3 years earlier at a remote compound in Nevada, where he had been part of an elite team hired to protect a piece of sensitive technology and the people guarding it. One night, the entire layer of professional protection around that compound had been taken apart, not through brute force, but through precise, almost surgical movements from a single man who never raised his voice and never killed anyone he did not have to. Hunter had never gotten a clear look at the man's face that night, but he remembered the cold steadiness of his eyes, the scar across his wrist, and the way he stood with his weight shifted slightly off-center, ready to move in any direction at once. That man had not harmed the people he overpowered. Instead, he had pulled a targeted engineer out of an internal betrayal nobody else in the compound had even noticed forming around them. In the years since, people in certain corners of the security world had spoken of him in hushed, half-believing tones, calling him by an unofficial name that suggested he could open any locked room, including ones meant to hold a person until they died inside it. Hunter had assumed, like most people who heard the story secondhand, that the man was more legend than fact, right up until he found himself standing in front of Mason in a Chicago lobby with his hand still raised. He stepped back slowly and lowered his arm without finishing the motion he had started. Charlotte's voice cut through the quiet, sharp with disbelief, demanding to know why Hunter was refusing a direct order in front of the entire board. Hunter answered quietly, almost too quietly for the room to hear, saying that this was not a man anyone should put their hands on. The words carried anyway, traveling through a lobby that had gone unnaturally still, and several people who had been filming the humiliation on their phones lowered them slightly, sensing the story had just changed shape. Charlotte felt the embarrassment double inside her chest, because her own bodyguard had just announced, in front of the people she most needed to impress, that the man she had spent the last several minutes mocking was someone to be afraid of. Mason still did not raise his voice or claim credit for anything. He simply said, in the same even tone he had used from the beginning, that the building had a serious gap in its security, and that the visitor he had stopped needed to be located and questioned immediately. Connor pushed his way forward at that point, accusing Mason of inventing a crisis to cover for his own incompetence, his voice loud enough to pull attention away from the quiet alarm Mason had just raised. Charlotte, stung and unwilling to lose any more ground in front of the board, made the only decision her pride would allow her to make in that moment, and ordered Mason suspended on the spot. He did not argue. He unclipped his badge, set it gently on the reception counter, and turned to leave, pausing only once to glance up at a camera mounted near the ceiling on the third floor. Before he reached the door, he said, without looking back, that the building's systems would slip out of anyone's control within the hour. Nobody in the lobby reacted to the warning the way they should have, too caught up in the spectacle of his removal to notice the quiet certainty in his voice. A few seconds later, the security lights along the ceiling flickered once, almost imperceptibly, a small electrical stutter that most people in the lobby dismissed without a second thought. Only Hunter turned to look at the lights, and only Hunter understood, with a sinking feeling settling low in his stomach, that the man walking out the door had just told them exactly what was coming. Mason left the lobby in a silence heavier than anything spoken inside it, walking past a handful of employees who clearly wanted to say something in his defense, but lacked the nerve to do it in front of Charlotte and Connor. Charlotte walked into the board meeting moments later, irritated but satisfied, convinced she had just removed a disruptive employee before he could cause any further embarrassment. Connor used the momentum of that small victory to push harder for a proposal already sitting on the table, urging the board to approve an emergency transfer of internal security oversight to an outside partner firm he claimed could close the gaps in the system far faster than an internal team ever could. That partner firm, hollow at its center, existed only to give cover to the very group now trying to seize control of Sterling Group from the inside. While the board debated the proposal, small failures began rippling through the building's infrastructure, each one easy to dismiss on its own. The private elevator bank stuttered and slowed. A technical floor locked itself down through a remote command nobody in the room had issued. The cameras covering the underground garage lost their signal for several seconds before flickering back to a feed that looked, to anyone watching closely, slightly delayed from real time. Hunter noticed the pattern immediately and recognized that this was not the kind of glitch that came from old wiring or a tired server. He suggested carefully that someone bring Mason back into the building, only to be shut down by Charlotte, whose pride was still too raw from the morning to admit she might have made a mistake within hours of making it. Connor seized the opening eagerly, suggesting to the board that Mason himself might be behind the disruption. A disgruntled employee taking quiet revenge after being suspended in front of everyone he worked with. The accusation found fertile ground among board members already anxious and looking for someone simple to blame. Outside the building, unaware of how quickly his name was being turned into a convenient villain, Mason checked his phone and discovered that his emergency access credentials had already been wiped from the system entirely. He understood immediately what that meant. Someone with real authority inside Sterling Tower wanted him erased from the story before the story had even finished happening, and they wanted whatever came next to land squarely on his shoulders instead of their own. He did not walk away. Near a side entrance reserved for deliveries, he noticed a dark sedan parked at an angle that made no sense for casual visitor parking, and something about its shape pulled at a memory he had been quietly keeping records of for weeks. He recognized it from notes he had taken privately after spotting it twice before near unauthorized access points, details he had saved without anyone above him ever bothering to ask why. Mason chose to stay near the building's perimeter, not because his job required it any longer, but because he understood, more clearly than anyone inside that tower, that ordinary people who had done nothing wrong were now standing closer to real danger than they realized. Inside, far above him, Charlotte stepped into her private elevator, already exhausted by a morning that had only grown heavier with every passing hour. The doors closed normally, and for a moment everything felt routine again, the hum of the cab rising steadily between floors. Then the elevator shuddered once and stopped completely, suspended between two floors with no warning and no explanation. On the small security display built into the elevator wall, the live feed that should have shown the lobby below dissolved abruptly into a flat, featureless black. Charlotte, Hunter, Connor, and two members of the board found themselves trapped together in the executive elevator. The cab lit only by a dim emergency bulb that buzzed faintly overhead. Internal communication had gone dead, jammed by a signal blocker that someone had activated with quiet precision somewhere inside the building's technical core. Hunter worked at the manual release near the doors, only to discover that the locking mechanism itself had been seized remotely from a control room nobody outside Connor's small circle had access to. Connor performed alarm well, his voice pitched just high enough to sound frightened, while privately he understood that every additional minute trapped in that cab was a minute closer to the outside team finishing what they had come to steal. Charlotte, pressed against the cold metal wall, began to understand slowly and painfully that whatever was happening now was far larger than a single difficult morning in the lobby. She turned to Hunter and asked quietly enough that only he could hear her whether Mason could possibly have known something like this was coming. Hunter answered with obvious reluctance, admitting that Mason might be the only person in the entire building who actually understood how deeply their systems had already been compromised. Charlotte said nothing in response, the silence sitting heavy between them as she recognized, perhaps for the first time, that her own pride may have pushed away the one person capable of stopping whatever was unfolding around her. Outside, Mason watched the flow of people moving past the glass walls and noticed two unfamiliar figures slipping in through a delivery entrance that should have required clearance he knew they did not have. Without a badge of his own anymore, he relied instead on years of memorized blueprints, moving through an old maintenance corridor that most current employees did not even know existed. A cleaning worker named Lisa, who had once received quiet help from Mason during a difficult night shift, recognized him near the service stairwell and unlocked a side door without asking why he needed it. Mason was careful not to pull her any deeper into danger than necessary, asking only that she use her personal phone from the building next door to call the police, away from any system that might be monitored from the inside. He slipped into the technical wing, staying clear of the cameras he already knew had been compromised, moving with the quiet economy of someone who had done this kind of thing long before this particular morning. Back in the elevator, Connor increased the pressure on Charlotte, suggesting that signing an emergency transfer of control to his outside partner was the fastest, perhaps the only, way to restore the building's systems before anyone got hurt. Charlotte, exhausted, frightened, and running out of options that felt like her own, came dangerously close to giving in to him. Hunter watched Connor's calm in the middle of an apparent crisis and felt something tighten uncomfortably in his chest, a suspicion forming that a man this composed during chaos this severe was not simply a frightened executive caught in bad luck. Just as Charlotte lifted a pen toward the document Connor had produced, the elevator shook hard once and stopped its frantic vibration entirely. A voice broke through the static of the emergency speaker, distorted but unmistakable, telling Charlotte clearly not to sign anything at all. Charlotte froze where she stood, the pen suspended above the paper, as the full weight of recognition settled over her. The man she had thrown out of her company only hours earlier was already inside the building, already moving toward her, already trying to save her life. Mason moved through a narrow technical corridor and managed to restore a fragment of the building's secondary communication line, just enough to push a signal through to Hunter's earpiece. Hunter asked him directly, his voice low and careful, which unit he had once served with, the question carrying more weight than its simple wording suggested. Mason did not answer the question directly, telling Hunter instead to keep Charlotte as far away from Connor as he possibly could. The way Mason avoided the question told Hunter everything he needed to know, confirming a suspicion that had been building since the moment he first recognized the scar on Mason's wrist back in the lobby. This was not a man who had wandered into private security work by accident. This was someone who had once belonged to a strategic response unit built specifically to handle internal betrayal inside companies tied to national defense work. A man trained to read structures, people, and threats long before they became visible to anyone else in the room. Mason had never been a mercenary or a man who enjoyed violence for its own sake. He had once been assigned to protect an engineer who tried to expose corruption inside a powerful organization, only to be abandoned by the very leadership that had sent him on the assignment once the mission became politically inconvenient, forced out of the work entirely soon after. He chose deliberately to disappear into the quiet anonymity of ordinary security work rather than risk being pulled back into a world that had already cost him so much. Becoming a single father had only strengthened that choice, sharpening his desire for a stable, unremarkable life far away from anything resembling the danger he had once lived inside every single day. Charlotte, catching fragments of the exchange through the speaker, felt a heavy wave of shame settle over her as she replayed every cruel word she had thrown at him only hours earlier in front of the entire board. Connor understood almost instantly that Mason was unraveling his plan faster than he had accounted for, and he quietly signaled the team waiting outside to escalate to a more aggressive plan. Two intruders moved toward the server room with practiced efficiency, intending to extract the core of Sterling Group's most sensitive data before anyone could stop them. Mason reached the server room only seconds behind them, but one of the two men intercepted him in the narrow hallway just outside the door. He handled the confrontation quickly and without unnecessary force, neutralizing his opponent in a matter of seconds without leaving him seriously hurt, the kind of precision that came from years of training, rather than anger. The encounter made it unmistakably clear that Mason was nothing close to an ordinary security guard. a fact Hunter absorbed through the static of the earpiece with a growing uneasy certainty that the old stories about him had been understated rather than exaggerated. Inside the server room, Mason found a small device wired directly into the building's core network, a piece of equipment that did not belong there and had clearly been installed with careful planning over a span of months rather than hours. The sophistication of it told him everything he needed to know about how long Connor had been preparing this moment, patiently waiting for the right combination of distraction and opportunity. As he traced the wiring further, something far more troubling settled into focus, a realization that reshaped everything he thought he understood about the morning's events. The true target of this entire operation had never been the data sitting quietly on those servers. It was Charlotte herself, and whatever signature only she could provide. The elevator finally released, but instead of opening onto safety, its doors revealed a darkened hallway already under the control of Connor's people. Connor dropped any remaining pretense of fear, raising a small control device toward the locking system and ordering Charlotte to walk ahead of him without resistance. He told her plainly that the moment she signed the emergency transfer of control, he would effectively become the man running Sterling Group, hidden safely behind the hollow partner company he had built for exactly this purpose. Charlotte understood all at once that the company's recent string of failures had not been bad luck at all, but a pattern Connor had engineered carefully from the inside over a long stretch of time. Hunter lunged forward to intervene, only to be overwhelmed by two of Connor's men wielding a stun device and a close combat weapon, the narrow hallway working against him despite his considerable skill. Hunter was good, genuinely good, but the surprise and the tight space cost him precious seconds while he focused on shielding Charlotte rather than protecting himself. For the first time since stepping into her role as chief executive, Charlotte felt true fear settle into her chest, the kind that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or boardroom politics. Connor mocked her openly, telling her she had always been easy to manipulate precisely because she looked down on the people standing just beneath her. The accusation struck closer to the truth than Charlotte wanted to admit, landing directly on the same flaw that had led her to humiliate Mason only hours before. Mason, tracking the group through ventilation, access points, and a handful of secondary cameras Connor's people had overlooked, realized they were moving Charlotte toward the upper conference room, where an internal recording system could capture her signature as something that looked entirely voluntary. Connor intended to turn the forced transfer into a clean, legally defensible decision, fully documented on camera for anyone who might later ask questions. Mason reached Hunter through the restored communication line and told him to appear weaker than he actually was, buying time rather than fighting a battle he could not yet win. Hunter, trusting Mason completely for the first time since the morning began, followed the instruction without hesitation, letting his resistance soften just enough to avoid suspicion. Charlotte forced herself to stay composed, drawing on years of negotiation experience to stall Connor with careful, deliberate questions rather than open defiance. She asked him why he had chosen to betray a company that had given him everything he had built his career on. Connor answered with open contempt, telling her that Sterling Group only ever rewarded people who were born into power, and that he intended to prove power actually belonged to whoever understood how to exploit other people's weaknesses. Mason approached the upper conference room through an old emergency stairwell that almost nobody in the building still remembered existed, his steps quiet and unhurried despite the urgency driving him forward. He paused outside a frosted glass door, watching the blurred shapes moving within, and saw clearly enough to know that inside, someone was already pressing Charlotte's hand toward a digital signature pad. He had only seconds left before whatever Connor wanted recorded on that screen would become permanent and irreversible. Connor stood ready to capture Charlotte's signature on a screen designed to make a forced decision look like a calm, voluntary one. Charlotte glanced around the room and understood, with sudden clarity, exactly how isolated she had become. The rest of the board was locked away in another room. Hunter had been overpowered, and not a single employee in the building had any way of reaching her in time. She realized in that moment that every dollar of influence she carried meant nothing at all if she had placed her trust in entirely the wrong person. Just as Connor pressed her hand toward the signature pad and told her to finish what they had started, the conference room door opened on its own. Mason stepped through it wearing the same worn uniform from that morning, carrying no weapon, no badge, and no authority beyond the simple fact of his presence. Connor laughed at the sight of him, reminding the room loudly that this was a man who had already been removed from the company hours earlier. Mason answered calmly, telling Connor that switching the building into emergency override had been a mistake, because every action taken under that mode was already being copied automatically to a backup server entirely outside Connor's reach. Connor's expression flickered, just slightly, though he fought to keep his composure intact in front of Charlotte. One of his men rushed at Mason without waiting for instruction. Mason sidestepped him smoothly, locked his arm, and brought him down to the floor within seconds, the motion almost gentle in its precision. A second man pulled a close combat weapon, and Mason used a nearby chair and a length of curtain cord to disarm him just as quickly. The room filled not with violence, but with a kind of cold, controlled certainty that frightened everyone watching far more than blood ever could have. Hunter looked at Mason now with something close to genuine respect, the fear from earlier replaced by quiet admiration. Charlotte stared, stunned, realizing that the man she had once dismissed as nothing more than someone who opened doors was the same man now opening a path back toward her own survival. Connor, panicking, grabbed Charlotte and pulled her in front of himself as a shield. Mason did not rush forward. Instead, he calmly laid out every detail of Connor's plan in front of the room: the duplicated badges, the signal-blocking equipment, the hollow partner company, the stolen data, and the forced transfer document Connor had been so desperate to complete. Connor insisted with fading confidence that nobody could prove any of it. Mason nodded toward a small camera mounted in the corner of the room and told Hunter to look closely at it. The secondary camera, quietly restored earlier through Mason's work in the technical wing, had captured every word of Connor's confession and was already streaming it directly to a server the board itself controlled. Hunter rose to his feet then, not stepping backward out of fear this time, but stepping aside to let Mason finish what he had started. Police and an emergency response unit arrived at the building soon after, summoned by the call Lisa had made from outside, and the rest of the board was freed from the room where they had been confined for most of the morning. They watched the recovered footage together in stunned silence, the recording showing Connor pressuring Charlotte to sign away control of the company in language that left no room for misinterpretation. Connor tried to shift the blame toward Mason, calling him a dangerous former operative who had staged the entire crisis himself for reasons nobody in the room could quite follow. Mason did not respond with anger or with any need to defend himself emotionally. He simply laid out the evidence again methodically: the altered access logs, Connor's own data trail, the falsified partner contract, and the small device discovered wired directly into the server room. A board member named David confirmed that Mason had submitted an internal warning weeks earlier, one that had been quietly blocked before it ever reached anyone with the power to act on it. Hunter stepped forward as well, telling the room plainly that Mason had saved Charlotte's life and had never once endangered anyone who did not deserve exactly what was coming to them. Charlotte had to sit with an uncomfortable truth settling over her, the realization that she had protected the man actually betraying her company, while publicly humiliating the one person who had tried to warn her. Connor was taken into custody right there inside Sterling Tower, in front of the very people who had once feared the influence he carried inside those walls. As he was led away, he told Charlotte that she had never learned how to judge people correctly. The remark cut deeper than Charlotte wanted to admit, mostly because some part of it carried an uncomfortable grain of truth. The board offered Mason a generous reward along with the immediate restoration of his position, eager to celebrate him publicly as the man who had saved the company from collapse. Mason turned down most of the recognition entirely, asking only that the employees who had quietly helped him that day be protected from any retaliation for what they had done. Charlotte watched him decline praise that most people would have welcomed without hesitation, and understood with growing discomfort that he had never once wanted to be treated as a hero. That realization only deepened the shame she already carried from the morning's events. The room slowly emptied as officers finished their work and board members drifted off in small, quiet clusters, still processing everything they had witnessed. Charlotte remained behind, standing a short distance from Mason, no longer carrying herself like a chief executive addressing an employee. For the first time since either of them had met, she stood in front of him simply as a person who owed him an apology and finally understood it. Charlotte apologized to Mason in front of the board, and the employees still gathered nearby, refusing to soften the moment with excuses or careful phrasing. She admitted, plainly, that she had humiliated him out of status, pride, and a deep fear of losing control in front of people whose approval she desperately needed. Mason did not use the moment to embarrass her further, nor did he take any quiet satisfaction in watching her struggle through the admission. He simply told her that even the strongest security system in the world meant nothing if the person at the top refused to listen to the people standing at the front line. The words settled over Charlotte slowly, reshaping something in how she understood leadership itself. The board proposed that Mason take over as the head of internal security for the entire company, a role with real authority and real visibility. Mason hesitated. aware that accepting it would pull him back into a world full of exactly the kind of attention and danger he had spent years carefully avoiding. Charlotte did not pressure him toward an answer, telling him only that the company needed someone like him, but that the choice belonged entirely to him and to no one else. Mason eventually agreed, but only after laying out 3 conditions he considered non-negotiable. He wanted protection guaranteed for every employee at the bottom of the company's hierarchy, a full investigation into the rest of the executive floor, and a new system ensuring that every security warning, regardless of who raised it, would be formally logged and reviewed. Charlotte accepted every condition without hesitation, recognizing immediately how reasonable each one was given everything the company had just survived. Hunter approached Mason afterward and offered a small, respectful nod, an unspoken acknowledgement between 2 men who understood each other in a way words rarely captured. He admitted that he had heard whispered stories about a man like Mason years earlier, never expecting that the same person would choose such a quiet, unremarkable life instead of chasing recognition. Mason told him simply that nobody needed to know about the past as long as the present stayed peaceful and steady. Charlotte heard the exchange and finally understood that Mason was not a man who had failed at something greater, but one who had deliberately set aside glory to protect the things that mattered far more to him. A missed call from home flashed briefly across his phone screen while he stood there, a small reminder that underneath everything that had happened that day, he remained, first and always, a father waiting to get back to the one person who needed him most. Charlotte watched him glance at the screen and soften, if only for a second, and found herself wondering whether she could learn something essential about leadership from a man she had once dismissed without a second thought. Several weeks later, Sterling Tower looked and felt like a different building entirely. Charlotte had reorganized the company's leadership structure from the ground up, removing managers who had spent years abusing the small amounts of power they held and opening a direct line for any employee to raise a concern without fear of being dismissed or ignored. Mason settled into a new role as a special security advisor, never seeking attention and never appearing in any press release, though everyone who worked inside that building understood exactly who had kept Sterling Group from collapsing that morning. Hunter remained at Charlotte's side as her personal protection, but something fundamental in his manner had shifted. The easy arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet habit of checking in with Mason whenever something felt even slightly out of place. Lisa and the other employees who had helped Mason during the crisis were protected exactly as promised, and several of them were publicly recognized for the courage they had shown when nobody was watching them closely enough to expect it. Charlotte crossed the same glass lobby one afternoon, passing the very spot where she had once humiliated a man she barely bothered to look at. This time, she stopped at the security desk without giving an order or offering a sharp remark, greeting Mason instead with the simple, "Even respect one professional owes another." A visiting investor asked her quietly, almost as an afterthought, why she allowed a former security guard to carry so much influence inside her company. Charlotte answered without hesitation, telling him that titles could always be purchased, but character revealed only when everything around a person was falling apart could never be bought at any price. Mason heard the exchange but did not react with pride or satisfaction, returning his attention instead to the exits, the elevators, and the quiet blind spots he had checked out of habit for years. The story closed on an ordinary afternoon with Mason standing in the lobby of Sterling Tower in his simple security uniform, no longer invisible to the people who passed him, though he had never once asked to be seen at all. Charlotte understood now that the day she had mocked him in front of the entire board was the same day she had come closer than she ever realized to losing everything she had built. And the day Hunter stepped back in fear inside that same lobby was the day the rest of the building finally learned what everyone should have noticed from the very beginning, that the man they had dismissed as the least important person in the room was the only one truly capable of protecting it when it mattered most.